All right, kind enough to join us here on the podcast. She's the author of a great book that's out now, Democracy in Darkness. She's also a professor over at Notre Dame, and that's Katlyn Carter. Katlyn, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I was reading this book last night as my wife was reading her book. We like reading books at night. She's on the iPad. I'm on the actual physical copy. And I had a bunch of different questions lined up for you. But first, for our audience, maybe it's not familiar with the book or they're at a Barnes and Noble right now and they see this on the shelves. Tell our audience a little bit about this book and what made you want to write it.
Yeah, well, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a couple years before I went to graduate school, and I was doing media relations. And I got really interested in the relationship between public opinion and our elected officials. So I was particularly interested in the role of the media in facilitating that relationship. So when I went to graduate school to study history, I thought, I'm going to go back to the origin. I'm going to go back to the 18th century and look at how people at the time thought about these questions when they were setting up our government. So the book really tries to understand the origins of modern representative democracy by looking at how people thought about what should be done openly, transparently, and what could be done in secret. And I just found that debates about that really spoke to the core of how representative democracy came to function in the US and also in France.
In your book, you talk about the role of the perception of transparency. As you just mentioned, the formation of the governments in the US and France. Looking at this now in 2023, how do we still experience because your book also mentions that the reactions from both citizenry was a little different by the way transparency and secrecy played out. When we look at those two nations, in the current time, has that played any role in the influence? I ask this partly because I think of even the reaction that the French will sometimes have to like a labor dispute, like people run to the streets and are much more active. Whereas in the US, We're seeing an uptick in that and in labor as well. But oftentimes our reaction can sometimes be more muted in deference to our political officials as opposed in France.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, the book really traces a different attitude, as you note at the beginning, toward questions of transparency and secrecy in government. So in France, from the beginning of their revolution in 1789, there's this real commitment to transparency, absolute transparency, as much as they can do it. So keeping open doors to all their legislative meetings and meetings where they're writing their constitution, for example. And there's this real kind of expectation that there's going to be open doors and that those records are all going to be published. And they, for the most part, revolutionaries really commit to that. In the United States, it's not so much that. There's absolutely those who do have that expectation. But there's also another facet in the United States. There's also a kind of a group that says, wait a minute, there's some utility for meeting behind closed doors sometimes and kind of deploying secrecy, especially in the deliberative process. So in the US, there's much more of a willingness to embrace that and kind of use those tactics in politics early on, and then it kind of gets a little bit more transparent going forward into the 19th century, whereas France kind of goes the other way and kind of tries to shut things down a little bit as it goes forward into the 19th century. But yeah, I think we see the legacies of that today. I mean, I argue in the book that the importance of the use of that kind of secrecy at the founding moment, had lasting implications for how we think about representative government and the way in which we think it becomes legitimate. So, we tend to have a higher tolerance for our elected officials, going to today, Washington, and saying, okay, we elected them to go and make the best decisions. And there's some, a degree of kind of trust in that. And in France, I mean, there's more of a legacy of we want our elected officials to do exactly what we tell them to do and want them to do. So I think that, yeah, you can see some legacies of that down to the present day.
There's a bunch in the book that we're going to get to. We're going to get into some secrecy that you just mentioned there. I love that I did not know this before you came on about that you had worked in DC and some of the overlap between you and I. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. But first thing, it's something I noticed in the book yesterday. And it was funny because we were teasing the interview in recent episodes. And I had said accidentally, democracy dies in darkness. And then it's because of the WAPO masthead. And then I realized you actually mentioned it in the book about democracy dies in darkness is darkness, excuse me, is the masthead of the Washington Post. But it was founded in the secrecy of darkness. I'm paraphrasing what you said. How does your book get at reconciling that? Because you mentioned it in the beginning of the book. You're like, I'm going to take you through. So without giving it all away for everybody, tell us a little bit about that dichotomy between those two sentences.
Yeah, so the book traces the origins of that kind of claim that we can find on top of the Washington Post today, that democracy dies in darkness. That's kind of the conviction that came about in the Age of Revolutions itself back in the 18th century. So the book kind of shows how transparency really came to be considered very central to democracy in the modern era. But at the same time, the book starts with this question of, well, how do we explain that at the same time our Constitution in the United States was written behind closed doors under oath of secrecy? And so the book tries to point out that despite our commitment to transparency and how much that's used in rhetoric about politics and especially about democracy, in fact, our founding moment and many other important moments in our politics actually do occur in secrecy or use secrecy throughout the deliberative process. So the book just kind of points out that there is that disagreement sometimes between what's happening in practice and in action versus what people are talking about rhetorically as being really central to democracy.
Caitlin, on that subject of secrecy, I wanted to get your thoughts about voting, at the legislative level, because often right now our politicians, even the most ignorant of those, will proudly talk about the way they voted. And it sometimes often seems as though there are politicians who could be swayed to possibly cross party lines, but there's the pressure of constituents, there's the pressure of the media that if it's found that a person votes a certain way, that it would go against them in an upcoming election. Where's your stance on the possibility of what I would consider essentially a blind election where no one outside of the legislative body knows who voted on what? Could that possibly be a corrective for what we're seeing now in terms of political infighting and tribalism?
Yeah, I came into this project thinking that transparency is always the best policy. And I sort of came in with that kind of bias. I think that is our just contemporary bias when thinking about these issues. But as I worked through the project, I started to think about it a little differently. And I started to think maybe that's not always true, and that there might, in fact, be a role for some level of secrecy in promoting better policy decisions or promoting compromise or changing of minds or opinions. And I think that you're right. I mean, we've seen that come up sometimes recently. I think it was in the first Trump impeachment hearing, you did have some officials, I remember, kind of saying, well, if this vote happened, if this was a secret vote, in the Senate, that actually he might be convicted, right? Versus if it's a public vote, it'll never happen. And I think that, you sometimes see that come up, but there's a real reticence to ever do that. And I don't know. I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily something we should do, because it's all case dependent, right? And if you start allowing all votes to happen in secret, then, I think that can also lead down some dangerous roads where policymakers become really divorced from public opinion or their constituents, far more than we would want them to be.
Quick break from our pod to tell you about a new pod at Fresh Roasted Coffee, Envy Pods. So if you go to freshroastedcoffee.com, my partner's shaking his head. That's a good transition. Are you kidding me?
It was good. No, I shook my head. I was like, that's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because I saw this picture earlier. I was like, I saw what you're doing.
It is pretty good. That's right. So listen, the new Envy Pods over at freshroastedcoffee.com, the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk, environmentally safe, compostable. You can go check these out at freshroastedcoffee.com. When you open up the package, it smells delicious. I'm telling you, you can't smell it on here, but I promise you that when I opened this morning to make my cup of coffee, it was delicious. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. Use the promo code CANWEGET20 for 20% off your first order, or hit the link in our show details. Professor Carter, you just mentioned the former president. If you say his name 3 times like Beetlejuice, he may appear. So I did want to get into that because it's so funny, because here is somebody, and you wrote about this in the book, about the thin line between, democracy and autocracy. And the former president recently made some statements on an interview with Univision down here in my neck of the woods in Miami, talking about some of the things that he would do as president in terms of, either prosecuting political opponents or at least going after it from the investigation standpoint. Mm-hmm. That doesn't feel democratic. What do you make of the current state of politics in America, where there is somebody running on a platform like that kind of fails in the face of what democracy is supposed to sound and look like. And is there any parallels in your book? We have a bunch of authors over my shoulder here that have drawn on historical parallels between media coverage in the 70s of figures like this to now. Is there anything in the book that you, as you were writing this and looking back, anything that there was like a Trump-like figure that did some of this stuff that you kind of relayed, or at least in your research learned a little bit more about?
Yeah, I don't think I can point to any specific person where I would say this is a parallel to Donald Trump. He, in many ways, I think he is new and unique, which is not to say that everything about him or his presidency or campaign is, unprecedented. But I mean, I think that you point to something important, which is that over the last several years, our democracy has felt like it's especially fragile. And we're seeing a lot of norms broken. We're seeing a lot of kind of forays into behavior, rhetoric that we would think of as more authoritarian. So, I mean, one thing that I would think of in terms of historical parallel, or something that jumped out to me when I was writing the book, is that in the 18th century, a lot of these people I'm writing about really thought, transparency is it's the cure. It's the cure for demagogues. That's the way that demagogues will be brought down. If we just have more publicity, more transparency, they can't really stand up to scrutiny like that. And I think that Donald Trump, living through recent years kind of poses a challenge to that line of thinking, because, the more transparency, the more publicity, media coverage of, him and things that he says, you're starting to see a lot of people question, if that is a good thing, that's the role of journalists to provide that kind of scrutiny, or if it is, potentially having a negative effect and providing him a lot of attention and kind of the fuel to continue being a presence in politics when otherwise he might not. So the book actually does speak to that. I think some of the unforeseen consequences or complications of transparency and the potential for that to turn into something that's a bit more performance or spectacle in politics. And I do think those of us who have been following things for the last decade probably have found ourselves thinking about that a fair amount, the role of spectacle in politics.
It's to that end about your awareness of American politics. You're an educator. Right now, most recently, actually, we had a musician that was complaining about spending in New York City, budget shortfalls, and then placing that at the feet of the president. When you have college students in your classroom, what do you find to be the biggest the biggest blind spots that students have? And then if you could be able to talk to high school teachers, middle school social studies teachers, what do you wish would happen more in more of the K-12 setting about better either preparing students or making sure students are a little bit more civically or in general aware of how our government actually works by the time they get to your classroom?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that is something that's really important and we definitely need more of. So, right now I'm teaching a class on the Constitution, the history of the Constitution. And, always coming in, I ask, how many of you have ever read the Constitution? And often not many of them have. And that really mirrors, the broader American public. So I think it would be great if we had more of a focus on, actually reading things like our Constitution, knowing how the branches of government work, and really, learning and teaching American history. I think it's really vital if we want to prepare kids to become responsible adults and participants in our society, that they need to have that grounding. And they also need to know how to think for themselves. I mean, that's something else I notice, especially now, is that, if you ask students where they get their news or how they get their information, it is really atomized. And often they're going to social media, and that's kind of how they're consuming information. So I do think we also need to think just about information literacy and thinking about, how do we, ensure that we're sending people out there who are equipped to take in the fire hose of media and information coming at them, and actually discern true from false, and make their way through that so that they can have informed opinions and participate.
Mike, a moment ago, talked about the former president of the United States. I want
Mhm.
to ask about the incoming president of Argentina. I'm going to totally take a different sway.
Okay.
But the most recent election, you had Javier Milei, who is a Trump disciple, very similar former TV person, economist, completely goes off script, talks about getting rid of government institutions, and transparency is very much a part of his platform. I bring this up because A, he just won, but B, it seems like there is this idea that the more transparent government is the way to go. And as a historian, as a professor, has that model ever worked? It seems that, I mean, in your research, it seems like the answer is you came in with the eyes of maybe it could and not so much. But in your learning, has it ever been the case, or are we being dangerously naive when a government or a government leader promises you essentially to have glass houses in their government buildings, entirely glass houses?
Sure. I mean, in all of human history, I don't know, I can't speak to all of human history, but I can speak to the, examples that I know well, which is the 18th century, the founding of kind of modern representative democracy. And yeah, I mean, what I found is that if in France, for example, where they really were dedicated to a high level of transparency, that was done to try to foster trust between the public and their elected officials at a moment when they're trying to establish a representative democracy for the first time. Um, but it had a paradoxical effect of actually sometimes undermining trust in the government, because when people could see, everything their elected officials did, everything they said, those who were following closely often, kind of raised their voices and said, "Wait a minute, I don't actually really agree with what you're saying in there. I don't actually agree with what you're doing." And then that led to a sense that, well, how representative is this government if it doesn't seem to be aligning with expressed public opinion? Now, that's a little tricky because in the 18th century, ascertaining what public opinion actually was at any point was even harder than today. That's before public opinion polling and things like that we do have today. So, some of those challenges are maybe a little better, but in the end, I think that did teach us a lesson that we have to keep in mind, that sometimes, transparency can be, number one, more for show than it really is in substance. So, it also could be used to say, if you're going to make everything transparent, then it makes it harder for people to take that in, right? It actually could be a mechanism to hide different things just by inundating people with so much, to watch or see, that they can't really make sense of it. So that's one challenge. But another challenge, I think, that we might think about how doing that can sometimes empower the loudest or most proximate kind of voices of public opinion to government in a way that, they're not as empowered if they're not able to seize on every detail and piece of the process in politics. And when they are able to do that, it can sometimes have a counterintuitive effect of kind of undermining trust in the government, actually. So I think that's what my research and the precedent kind of shows on that.
Katlyn, before we let you go, we love to ask authors that come on the show this. So somebody's right now at a local bookstore, or they're at a national chain. They happen to see the book. Oh, Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy, Transparency in the Age of... Give the elevator pitch if you were standing over their shoulder and being like, "Hey, that's my book. Let me tell you a little bit about it." Give them the elevator pitch as to why they should purchase this book.
Yeah, I would say, do you want to try to understand better how our democracy came to look the way that it does and function the way that it does? This book might be for you. It uses debates over what should be transparent and what could be secret in government to try to understand how people thought about democracy as a form of government and how it should work. And these are questions that we are still grappling with today. So if you're trying to come up with your answer to that and what you think about these questions, I think the book might be really interesting to you in providing some historical context.
That's understatement of the year about what's happening with democracy right now. I can't thank you enough, Katlyn, for coming on the podcast. Like I mentioned, Democracy in Darkness, you can go get the book wherever books are sold. Continued success to you. Your students at Notre Dame are lucky to have you. Please be safe.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.